Hi and welcome to Boston Media Theory. I'm Marcus Breen. This is a show where we talk about theories to do with media and communication with people who live and work in Boston and indeed in the immediate surrounds. And those people may be researchers, academics, activists, otherwise engaged in important area of media and communication. Today I'm delighted to welcome to the show Philip Mead, who's a fellow Australian, so we're populating the airwaves as it were, and I'd like to welcome Philip here, and thank you for being here, Philip.
Great to be here, Marcus.
Yes. Now we'll start with your provenance, as we say, where you're from, which is the University of Western Australia, which is about, I think, as far as you can get from Boston before you start returning home if you were to continue.
That's right. The University of Western Australia is in Perth, the capital city of Western Australia, which is on the western edge of Australia and therefore on the Indian Ocean. So I haven't always lived there, but I've lived there for the last 5 or so years, and it's a great place, but it's a long way from here.
It is a very long way from here, and the University of Western Australia is actually quite a highly ranked university for a number of reasons.
Yes, it's one of Australia's what we call the GO8 universities, so it's one of the older, larger universities.
Right. Now the reason you're in Boston is because while you're still an employee of the University of Western Australia, you are here for, is it 1 year, 1.5 years as a visiting professor at Harvard University?
That's right. I'm here as visiting professor, chair of Australian Studies at Harvard University, which is for a year, for the academic year 2015-16, because that's a position which which is filled each year with someone from Australia in a broad range of areas. It just happens that I'm a literary studies or English person, but it can be someone from history or environmental studies or economics and anthropology, for example, and has been in the past.
Yeah, yeah. Of course, the irony in the title of the position that you have is the Gough, Whitlam and Malcolm Fraser Visiting Professor of Australian Studies at Harvard University. And anybody who knows Australian history will perhaps scratch their head and think, well, how did those two people come to be in the same title, given that in the 1970s they were at each other's throats, as it were, because they were leaders of opposite political parties in Australia?
They were indeed, and in fact they were locked in a death roll, really, in the 1970s.
The crocodiles.
Yeah, that's right. Gough Whitlam was the Labor Prime Minister, and Malcolm Fraser was the Liberal Party Prime Minister who succeeded him after having ousted him, I guess, from power. But the position has been going since 1976 at Harvard, and it was in fact a gift of the Australian government to the US for the bicentennial, for the US's bicentennial, right. Yeah, 1776. So the idea, I guess, is to foster dialogue, cultural dialogue, exchange between Australia and the US, which of course are, old and strong allies.
Right. Although, as someone who was born and educated in Australia, 1776 was just 6 years after Australia was claimed for the British Commonwealth, or for England, by Captain James Cook.
Yeah.
The US was already well advanced.
That's right. They were just starting on nationhood at that time.
That's
whereas
right.
We were just being claimed for the British throne. Yeah.
The great revolution of emancipation had been held and won pretty much.
That's right.
Yeah.
The Revolutionary War, the War of Independence, had just happened.
Yes. So it always strikes me that Australians are a little bit shell-shocked by some of the dates we see when we're born and raised, to think that the world really started in 1770, when
That's
of course
right.
It didn't.
No, of course. Yeah.
When you're teaching at Harvard, what exactly is the challenge that you face with educating, I guess, American students, but also their multicultural and international liberal arts students about Australian culture?
Yeah. Well, it's been a fascinating experience, and not surprisingly, there's not, amongst the student body at Harvard, there's not a lot of, it's a very diverse body, but there's not a lot of knowledge about Australia. So it's an interesting challenge. On the other hand, there's a lot of interest in Australia, I think. Interest in Australia as a place, and to some extent popular forms like music or film are known, but literature much less so. So it's an interesting dialogue exchange, because what I can do is say, look, you're interested in this place, let me tell you about its literature. Its literature is interesting too. You've never read anything or come across it, but it is very interesting, so let me tell you about it. And that seems to work. It's been fun. They have been interested, I must say, especially in the Indigenous. I taught a course in Indigenous Australian literature, Aboriginal writing, and one in another course about Australian literature in the world, so about its connections outside the national context.
Let's talk about the Indigenous matter for a minute, because it strikes me that it is a very different modality in this country compared to Australia. I'm not sure that the most Americans, if not all Americans, would have any idea of what an Indigenous American literature would look like, which would be books written by Native Americans.
Exactly.
But you use the phrase Indigenous literature in Australia, and people know exactly what's going on, and that it refers to the original inhabitants or the Australian Aborigines who lost their land.
That's right.
And who have been quite assertive and have been supported by various progressive governments over the years. So how do you negotiate and inform students and discuss the question of Indigenous, what do we say, indigeneity and Indigenous literature?
Yeah. No, you're quite right, Marcus. And one of the things I was doing was explaining those profound differences between our cultures, and the fact that Aboriginal culture in Australia goes back at least 50,000, probably 60,000 years, and that's a huge fact about Australia, is that it does have this does have a black history which is complex and goes back a long way. However, our point of settlement, our point of white settlement, some people would still call it invasion, is 1778 and 1788, and the tensions and violence and dispossession of that time, I think it's fair to say, haven't been resolved in Australia. They still remain live questions, I think, and I think you can see that in contemporary movements for reconciliation through the Constitution. At the moment in Australia, there are many Aboriginal people working with governments, both state and federal, about how to have Australia's First Nations people recognised in constitutions, or indeed the Victorian government, state Victorian government at the moment, is negotiating, is talking about a treaty with its Aboriginal people, which is first move of a state government of that kind. But what was surprising was that some of the students who showed up for my class were in fact Native American students.
Oh, really? Okay.
And so we could have very interesting discussions about those kinds of differences that you're alluding to. I could also talk about how Harvard was originally an Indian college. That it's founded as a college to educate the Indian people, and that history has been forgotten in some cases, but it's also still there, I think, in various important and obvious ways, with some of the archaeological work that's going on around the campus, but also in the history of education in the US.
I didn't know that. I had no idea that was part of the original idea of John Harvard.
Well, one of the first things that happened with the founders, I guess, was that they started translating the Bible into Algonquin and into local Indian languages, because they knew that was a way of spreading their message, spreading their mission. They were missionaries, I guess. But that means education. It means printing presses. It means translation, and the history of that aspect of first US settlement I find fascinating, and it has analogies with our. It's very different from ours, because our settlement is as a convict settlement, rather than as a religious haven for people who are dissenting from the Church in England and so on. So it's very different in some ways. But there are other similarities there in terms of how people in a new land, how they encounter First Nations people.
Yeah. It's also interesting for me as a communications and media scholar and researcher to think about the connection that you made between missionaries and literacy
Yes.
and publishing,
Yeah.
and the assumption that you would educate the natives, as it were,
Yes.
and that would lead to their salvation and whatever else,
Yes.
incorporation into middle class society. Very different in Australia, as far as I can recall. We didn't ever sit around about teaching the natives much until quite later.
That's right.
You know, we basically said, okay, there's a bunch of people out there and we don't
Yes.
necessarily seem to get on with them.
No.
And the decimation began.
That's right.
And there was plenty of decimation here, but
Yeah.
there's a very different configuration between
Yeah.
the English Puritans and the middle class settlement
Yeah.
and convict settlement,
Yep.
which is important class orientation as well, of course.
It's an important part of Australian history is that initial convict settlements at various places, and then the land grabs, I guess, by people emigrating freely to Australia, wanting land and space. And what happens is those sort of those violences and dispossessions tend to get followed by missionaries and philanthropists of various kinds who try to make up, I guess, for what the first settlers have done, and sometimes that involves education. It certainly involves studying Aboriginal people. You know, what we know about Aboriginal people comes from those early days, often comes from missionaries and people who are studying languages, making word lists,
Right.
and who have an anthropological interest. It looks like a dubious interest still to us, but nevertheless it is an interest in, you know, right around the globe in the 19th century. There's a kind of anthropological interest in other peoples, other cultures.
Well, you've raised an interesting question and thought in my mind, which of course that's relevant and been relevant, I suppose, for a long time, since maybe Terry Eagleton started bashing away about literary theory, which is you can't really leave English alone just to mould away in its literary test tube. Literary theory is now contextualised and it's part of a much larger field of communication and media.
Absolutely.
How does that inform the way that you approach the questions of culture and literature?
Yeah, well, that is my background. I think I start off as a sort of fairly classically trained English literature student, but very quickly, you know, I realised that, well, not only was I interested in Australian literature, and I always was right from the beginning. That always means that you're at a distance to some extent from the canonical origin of English literature, but you learn about that as well. But I also understood, because I was interested in Australian literature, I wanted to know about its relationship to history and culture and the places where I lived and my family lived. And you know, I grew up in a family who, while they weren't terribly academic, had quite a strong awareness of Australian writing and Australian culture, I guess, generally.
Yes.
And I knew that was what I was interested in as well. So, you know, today I'm someone who, you know, always thinks of literature in relation to society and culture and history.
Right.
Yeah.
Is there a determining, or maybe that's not the right word, but you can correct me, determining relationship between a sense of nation and identity and literature? Or is that too bold a claim?
I think there is, but it has different levels to it, Marcus. I think that, and one of the things I guess I've been arguing against recently is too simple an equation between ideas of national identity and cultural expression, to put it a little bit jargony. That is, you know, looking for Australian identity in a cultural form often leads to rather shallow results, I think. Because it will exclude lots of things. You know, it would exclude Aboriginal people. It would exclude, for a long time, women. those classical political aspects. To give you an example, I'm at the moment interested in the way in which something like mining, which is a big part of Australian history, that's why people come to Australia in the 1850s. It's why they go to California.
Mm-hmm.
It's why they go to Australia, is because they're in search of wealth. And in recent years as well, the Aboriginal people are constantly negotiating with mining these days, corporations, mining corporations. And our writers have written quite a lot about that aspect of Australia's history, and it hasn't really been organised, so it hasn't been recognised. So that's what I'm doing at the moment, is having a think about the way in which our literature, for example, has been formed and shaped by our economic history.
Oh, okay, right.
And that gives you a different story about identity from the from the normal one, I guess.
Yeah. Well, the normal one has been very much an association of literary theory and communication connected to high culture.
That's right.
Mm.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's a problem, I think, because my experience of literature is I understand how it's has been part of high culture in various national contexts, but it's not really my experience as an Australian. As I say, I grew up reading, the collected Shakespeare was right next to the Zane Grey novels, which was next to Henry Lawson or Banjo Paterson or something like that. Detective novels, crime fiction, for example, going right back to the 19th century is a very good way to, reading crime fiction is a really good way to understand a culture, I think, and
how so?
understand, how cities developed, for example, because you look at crime fiction and there's a whole lot of stories about crime in the outback, in rural settings, and then suddenly, writers are writing about crime in the city, which means they've got to tell you about the city and what it's like.
Right.
So then you understand about shifts, I guess, in something like criminality in Australian in any national history, and it's crime fiction that will tell you about, popular fiction will tell you about that more than other forms of literature. But I'm not one of those people who sort of is in any way troubled by the hierarchies of literature. I read from the lowest to the highest.
Well, there's also the question of how very large numbers of people are literate in other forms of media, which are as complex, if not more complex, than reading a novel.
Exactly.
So it will be pretty tacky if you didn't take that into consideration.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, for those of us who are academics, especially, to not understand and be reflective of the intensity of information that's flowing across devices like this.
Exactly.
In nanoseconds, which younger generations are consuming, well, us too, but younger generations are consuming in great volumes.
Yeah, well, look, one of the interesting things in say recent decades is the way in which literary forms as well have been changed by media forms. I'm interested in the way in which poetry, for example, has adapted to the movies. The way in which it's responded to the movies as a artistic form, in terms of imagery and narrative, and lots of poets have done and learned interesting things from film, which they're then doing in poetry. Contemporary fiction is very interested in social media, for example, and how it works, and how it, because novelists are interested in the way in which the world impacts on individuals and families and so on. They're interested in the way in which social media is used.
I was going to ask you a little bit about the way, the story I heard, because I had some association with movie production years ago, that many of the people who were writing episodes of The Simpsons were graduates of the English literary program at Harvard University.
Oh, really?
And I was always fascinated, and I'm still fascinated by that connection.
Yeah.
But I won't be sidetracked by that because I have another couple of questions, and then I want to ask you, and then we'll be finished, and that is, what does literature tell us about Australia as a nation, and then Australia's role in the world. If you could, give us a quick summary view of how you would either theorise that or how you would present that.
Well, it's a big topic, Marcus, but I think it as I say, it is a story about the place, an encounter with a continent. That's what Australian literature is often about from the beginning, and because it's a strange and outlandish place.
Yeah, I'll quote you on that, strange and outlandish.
Yeah, and it's dangerous, and it's,
it's dangerous. Full of venomous creatures.
Full of venomous creatures. And it's not what the Northern Hemisphere was dreaming of. They're dreaming of an inland sea. That sort of paradigm of what the new world should be like, whether it's a kind of southern Pacific island atoll, or the fertile prairies of North America. It was none of those things. So that's what the literature is about in lots of ways. It's about that encounter. But as I say, I think the other lesson that's important is that it's about the unresolved process of settlement. That is, it was Australia never had any treaties like New Zealand with the Waitangi Treaty.
We still don't have a treaty with the Indigenous people.
So it was just straight out land grab. It was straight out dispossession. There's no way around that. And to imagine that that's a sort of a worthy foundation for a modern nation is a problem, and therefore and also we now understand much better, I think, the importance and richness of Aboriginal culture, and it's how it could actually provide a future for Australia, because white Australian culture, you could say, is rather sort of bankrupt in lots of its only ideas are economic. Its ideas are only how can we dig up resources and send them overseas and sell them. It doesn't have much vision beyond that, you could say.
You could
Whereas
absolutely say that.
And Aboriginal people have a much more a deeper understanding of land, and a much more sustainable, to use that word, idea of land. I mean, Australian governments aren't thinking about Australia in 250 or 300 years' time.
No.
Whereas the Aboriginal people are. So I think we've got a lot to learn from them.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. And literature helps us learn that.
Absolutely. And I have to also add, just by way of my own thinking now, having lived in the United States for 20 years this year, how different the political life and political culture is in the two countries.
Yeah.
That Australia has a tradition of social democracy which is quite foreign to many Americans.
Yeah.
So even though there are those profound contrasts between white Australia and Indigenous Australia, and forms of injustice which are profound, we also have we being Australians have an interesting social democracy of welfare, of support, of generosity. And Americans who go to Americans who go to Australia always say, "Oh, what a wonderful place!"
Yes.
For all the things that it's realised and achieved.
Yeah. I think I'm very hopeful about Australian culture in that sense, but we do have to listen and learn. I think that's the main thing, I think, now.
Well, listening and learning is what you're paid to do.
Sounds rather sort of preachy, but I don't mean it like that.
Well, that's all right. Preaching is fine. This is Boston after all. What can you tell us about this thing you've been doing called with the MOOCs, the massive open online courses with the University of Western Australia? Because you're connecting, if I may say by way of preface, you're connecting your understanding of literature and place with a visual representation, as it were, in this online video course.
I ran a MOOC course, as they're called, a massive online open course for the Coursera platform, which my university signed up for, and they asked me to do that, and it was a fantastically interesting experience. There's varying opinions about MOOCs at the moment, and whether they're designed to. There's a conspiracy theory about MOOCs about how they're designed to do real people out of jobs, but I don't think that's true. And I took it on in the spirit of, okay, let's find out how this works, and it was fantastically interesting. And I think it worked. It was certainly quite popular for what Coursera call a niche course. And I based it on the idea that people were interested in Australia as a place, and that they didn't know, much like being here, that they didn't know much about the literature. So that what I did was I went to different places. I went to the west, I went to the centre, I went to the east coast to Sydney, and I talked about some of the literature associated with that place, those places. And the vast majority of people who took the course weren't Australian. They were from Asia or from North America, a lot of people from North America and from Europe. And I think, judging by the comments and discussions and dialogues, that they had a great interest in Australia as a place, and putting it together with literary representations of place, I think was serendipitous. It worked, I think. Yeah, because people are interested in different places. So there'd be a student who was a nurse in Azerbaijan or something like that, who was dreaming about going to Australia or something like that.
So how would you describe key literary figures in Australia as a way of, and who would you describe as a way of saying, well, here's a door to Australian culture, here's a door to understanding the country?
Well, for example, there are a number of writers that I looked at, like Christina Stead, who's an expatriate writer and lived in North America, so I could talk about her time there and her writing about Australia at the same time. When I looked at Patrick White, I thought, okay, well, who's one of Australia's Nobel Prize winning authors, I said, okay, let's have a look at his novel Voss, which is a novel from the 1950s, and it's based on the story of Ludwig Leichhardt, who's an explorer. So it's about 19th century exploration, it's about Aboriginal people, it's about the desire for land and land ownership. So it's about some of the fundamentals of Australian history and identity. But it's also, White has the idea of writing this novel when he's in the northern desert during the Second World War,
Northern African desert.
Yeah, Northern African desert, sorry, when he's in the Australian Air Force as an intelligence officer. And he has an idea about a sort of fanatical explorer. Yeah. And he bases it on the real-life explorer, Ludwig Leichhardt, who's, of course, a famous figure in Australian history. Maybe he's not so well known overseas, but he's famous for having disappeared into the centre of the country and has never been found. We don't, to this day, know what happened to him in the end. So that was interesting in terms of the number of different aspects of Australian history and place that it could talk about, that I could illustrate, I guess, is the point.
Right. And we've got to wrap up. So what would be one contemporary Australian author who meets the kind of criteria of place and as a problem, if you like? Yeah.
Well, there's a number, and there's a lot of terrifically interesting contemporary Australian writers. I'm particularly interested in the moment in an Aboriginal woman writer called Alexis Wright, who's written about the Gulf of Carpentaria in Australia's north. She's written a novel called Carpentaria, which is about weather and land and mythology and mining and Aboriginal history. It's a fantastically huge, large contemporary novel that also is fascinating because it seems to be using Aboriginal modes of storytelling that are different from the way white Australians and other people tell stories. The way in which Aboriginal people use narrative and tell stories is a fascinating thing, I think, because it's a deep part of their culture, because it was an oral culture. So telling stories and passing on knowledge and history through stories is something that she well understands. It's interesting. But there's others as well.
I'm sure there are others. Well, thank you, Philip. Philip Mead, Harvard University, University of Western Australia. We appreciate your contribution. And for now, that's it from me, Marcus Breen, from Boston Media Theory. Until next time.